The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Anyone with working eyes could see it. The same sharp jawline, the identical slope of the nose, those peculiar grey-green eyes that seemed to shift color depending on the light. Even the way they held their shoulders, slightly drawn back with an air of unconscious pride, was unnervingly similar. But one young man wore silk cravats and rode thoroughbred horses across the manicured lawns of Belle Rev Plantation. The other wore coarse cotton and worked those same fields from sunrise until his hands bled. In the suffocating social hierarchy of Tidewater, Virginia, 1854, such similarities were not merely noticed, they were dangerous. They whispered of secrets that polite society refused to acknowledge in daylight, though everyone gossiped about them behind closed doors and raised fans. And when a traveling photographer's camera captured both faces in a single frame, entirely by accident, it set in motion a cascade of events that would destroy one of Virginia's most prominent families and expose truths that some would kill to keep buried. This is not a story about justice or redemption. It is a story about what happens when a single image forces people to confront a reality they have spent years pretending doesn't exist. It is about the terrifying power of undeniable visual evidence in a world built on carefully maintained lies. And it begins, as so many tragedies do, with something as simple and permanent as a photograph. Belle Rev stood like a monument to old Virginia wealth, its white columns gleaming in the harsh summer sun of 1854. The plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of prime tobacco land along the James River, a kingdom unto itself where Alistair Dandridge ruled with the absolute authority afforded to men of his station. The main house, built by his grandfather in 1798, featured 16 rooms filled with imported furniture from London and Paris, crystal chandeliers that had once hung in a French chateau, and enough silver to fill 3 locked cabinets. But the true measure of Alistair's wealth wasn't found in chandeliers or silverware. It was found in the 63 human beings he owned, each one recorded in a leather-bound ledger with their estimated value written next to their names in neat, unfeeling script. Alistair Dandridge was 47 years old that summer, a tall man with thinning brown hair that he combed meticulously each morning to disguise the expanding bald spot at his crown. He had a broad face, florid from too much whiskey and too many heavy dinners, and those distinctive grey-green eyes that everyone in 4 counties recognized as a Dandridge trait. His father had them. His grandfather had them. They appeared in oil paintings hanging throughout the house, watching from gilded frames with expressions of stern judgment. He had married Evelyn Fairfax 23 years earlier, a union that pleased both families immensely. The Fairfaxes were old Virginia aristocracy with impeccable bloodlines but dwindling finances. The Dandridges had money but craved the social legitimacy that came with the Fairfax name. It was a transaction, really, dressed up in white lace and orange blossoms. Evelyn was 17 at the wedding, terrified and obedient. Alistair was 24 and already calculating how her connections would expand his influence. Their son Thomas arrived 11 months later, a squalling, red-faced infant who grew into a handsome young man with his father's distinctive features and his mother's refined manners. By 1854, Thomas was 22 years old, recently returned from 3 years at the University of Virginia, where he had studied law with adequate, if unspectacular, results. He had his father's height and those unmistakable grey-green eyes, but he had inherited something else from Evelyn. A certain gentleness, a discomfort with cruelty that Alistair found both puzzling and vaguely disappointing in his only son. Thomas had grown up at Belle Rev, surrounded by the casual brutality of plantation life, but unlike his father, he had never quite developed the ability to see enslaved people as property rather than human beings. He hid this weakness well, understanding instinctively that to voice such thoughts would mark him as dangerously radical, but the discomfort was always there, a constant low-grade nausea that he had learned to suppress. The Dandridge household also included Alistair's unmarried sister Catherine, a sharp-tongued woman of 45 who had never quite forgiven the world for failing to provide her with a suitable husband. She lived in the East Wing, spending her days embroidering pillowcases with increasingly elaborate patterns and making cutting remarks about everyone's behavior. Catherine noticed everything, forgot nothing, and wielded gossip like a weapon. This was the family structure at Belle Reve in the summer of 1854. Respectable, established, outwardly perfect. And then there was Samuel. Samuel had been born in the slave quarters of Belle Reve on a cold March night in 1832, the same year Thomas was born in the main house. His mother was Ilara, a house servant who had worked in the Dandridge household since she was 13 years old. Ilara was considered one of the privileged enslaved people at Belle Reve. She worked indoors, wore relatively clean clothing, and was rarely subjected to the backbreaking field labor that destroyed so many bodies before their time. She was also beautiful, with smooth dark skin, expressive eyes, and a quiet dignity that she maintained despite her circumstances. By the time she was 20 years old, Alistair Dandridge had noticed her. And in a world where enslaved women had no legal right to refuse their owners anything, what Alistair noticed he took. No one spoke of it openly, of course. Such things were never discussed in polite company. But the other enslaved people at Belle Reve knew. The house servants whispered about it when Evelyn was out of earshot. And when Ilara's belly began to swell in the late summer of 1831, everyone understood what had happened, even if no one would say it aloud. Samuel was born just 2 months after Thomas. For the first few years of his life, the resemblance wasn't particularly notable. Many babies share similar features, and no one expected to see Alistair Dandridge in the face of a slave child. But as Samuel grew, the similarities became impossible to dismiss. By age 5, Samuel had the same grey-green eyes as Thomas, the same narrow nose, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Old Jeremiah, who had worked at Belle Reve for 60 years and remembered Alistair's father, swore that Samuel looked more like a Dandridge than some of the legitimate white cousins who occasionally visited from Richmond. Ilara saw it, of course. How could she not? Every time she looked at her son, she saw the man who had forced himself on her reflected back. It was a complicated agony. She loved Samuel with a fierce protective intensity, but his face was a daily reminder of violation and powerlessness. She never spoke of his parentage, not even to Samuel himself. What would be the point? The truth couldn't free him. It could only endanger them both. As Samuel grew older, Ilara made sure he understood the fundamental rule of his existence. Blend in, stay quiet, never draw attention. In a world where enslaved people were punished for the smallest infractions, being the visible evidence of the master's adultery was potentially fatal. Alistair Dandridge would tolerate Samuel's existence only as long as he could ignore it. But ignoring became harder as Samuel reached adolescence, and the resemblance to Thomas became undeniable. By the time both young men were 22 years old, in that summer of 1854, they could have been brothers. Or rather, they looked like what they actually were: a legitimate son and his illegitimate half-brother, born to different mothers, but sharing the same father's unmistakable features. The enslaved community at Belle Reve walked on eggshells around this truth. They all knew, but they also knew that acknowledging it openly would bring disaster. Alistair had never publicly admitted to fathering Samuel, and no one expected he ever would. As long as the fiction was maintained, as long as everyone pretended not to see what was obvious to anyone with eyes, a fragile peace could be maintained. Thomas himself had noticed the resemblance years earlier, sometime around his 16th birthday. He had been walking through the tobacco fields, avoiding his father's expectations as he often did, when he saw Samuel working alongside several other young men. The late afternoon sun was hitting Samuel's face at an angle, and for a disorienting moment, Thomas felt like he was looking at his own reflection in strange clothes. He had stopped walking, staring openly, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to examine. Samuel had noticed his attention and immediately looked down, his shoulders tensing with fear. That reaction, the immediate assumption that a white man's attention meant danger, had shaken Thomas more than the resemblance itself. He had never confronted his father about it. What would he even say? The accusation seemed too enormous, too devastating. And part of Thomas didn't want confirmation, because confirmation would force him to reconcile the father he knew, stern but respectable, a pillar of the community, with the kind of man who would rape an enslaved woman and then enslave his own child. So Thomas did what his entire family had perfected. He pretended not to see. He avoided looking at Samuel directly. When they inevitably crossed paths, he looked through him rather than at him, as though Samuel were a piece of furniture rather than a person. This was the precarious situation at Belle Reve in July of 1854, when Silas Croft arrived at the front gate with his traveling photography equipment. Silas Croft was a man who lived out of a converted wagon that smelled perpetually of chemicals, silver nitrate, bromine, and the acrid tang of mercury vapor. He was 36 years old, originally from Baltimore, with thinning sandy hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. He had learned the daguerreotype process in 1850 and had spent the last 4 years traveling through the South, offering wealthy plantation owners the opportunity to capture their likenesses and their properties in permanent images. Photography was still relatively new and exotic in 1854, barely 15 years old as a commercial enterprise. The daguerreotype process, which created images on silvered copper plates, was complex, time-consuming, and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it, which made plantation owners ideal customers. They wanted portraits of their families, images of their grand houses, visual proof of their wealth and status that could be preserved for future generations. Silas had photographed dozens of plantations across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. He had captured stern patriarchs sitting rigidly for the lengthy exposures, delicate wives arranged in their finest silk gowns, children frozen in poses of idealized innocence. He had also photographed the plantations themselves, the grand houses, the manicured gardens, the fields stretching to the horizon. And sometimes, if the plantation owner requested it, he photographed the enslaved people. These images served a dual purpose. They were both documentation of valuable property and a form of boasting, visual evidence of the owner's wealth measured in human beings. Silas found these sessions profoundly uncomfortable, but he needed the money, and he had learned not to question his customers' requests. He arrived at Belle Reve on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July, his wagon rattling up the long oak-lined drive that led to the main house. Alistair Dandridge had sent for him 3 weeks earlier after seeing some of Silas's work at a neighboring plantation. The Dandridges wanted a formal family portrait. Alistair, Evelyn, Thomas, and Catherine arranged in front of the house. They also wanted photographs of the main house from various angles, images that could be sent to relatives in Richmond and Norfolk as evidence of Belle Reve's magnificence. Silas set up his equipment on the front lawn, a process that took nearly 2 hours. The daguerreotype camera was a large, unwieldy contraption mounted on a sturdy tripod. Creating images required preparing silver-plated copper sheets with iodine vapor in a specialized box, exposing them in the camera for anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes depending on the light, and then developing them with heated mercury vapor, a process that was both dangerous and requiring of precise timing. The family portrait was scheduled for Saturday morning when the light would be optimal. But Silas spent Friday setting up test shots, examining angles, and ensuring his equipment was functioning properly. This was when things began to go wrong, or perhaps right, depending on one's perspective. Silas was testing the light and exposure times in the late afternoon, positioning his camera to capture the front facade of the house. He wanted to ensure the white columns wouldn't be overexposed in the bright summer sun. As he was adjusting his equipment, setting up what he thought would be a simple architectural shot, several people crossed through his field of view. This wasn't unusual. Life on a plantation didn't stop for photography. Enslaved people were constantly moving about, carrying water, tending gardens, performing the endless labor required to maintain a property like Belle Reve. Silas had learned to simply wait them out, letting them pass before triggering his exposures. But this time, he didn't wait quite long enough. He had just removed the lens cap to begin the exposure when two young men walked into frame from different directions. One, Thomas, wearing a fine linen shirt and walking with the relaxed confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet, approached from the main house. The other, Samuel, carrying a basket of kindling and moving with the careful anonymity of someone trying not to be noticed, came from the direction of the dependencies. They crossed paths perhaps 15 feet from each other, neither looking at the other, both visible in the frame for perhaps 20 seconds before continuing in their respective directions. It wasn't enough time for a clear portrait. The daguerreotype process required absolute stillness to avoid blurring. But it was enough to capture their general forms, their profiles, their silhouettes against the White House. Silas didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a test exposure, not intended for delivery to the customer. He would develop it that evening to check his chemical mixtures and exposure times, then discard it before creating the real photographs the next day. That evening, in his wagon lit by lanterns and smelling of chemicals, Silas developed the test plate. When the image emerged from the mercury vapor, he nearly dropped it. There, captured on the silvered surface, were two young men in profile. The quality wasn't perfect. There was some motion blur, some loss of detail. But what was perfectly, undeniably clear was that they had the same face, the same profile, the same bearing, the same distinctive features that marked them as kin. One was dressed in fine clothes, the other in rough cotton. One was white, the other was black, but they had the same face. Silas stared at the image for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. He had been photographing southern plantations for 4 years. He was not naive about what happened on these estates, about the unspoken rules and hidden realities. He had heard the whispered jokes among white men about plantation children and night visits. But he had never seen the evidence presented so starkly, so undeniably, as in this single image. The resemblance was impossible to explain away. This wasn't a vague similarity or a coincidental shared feature. This was clear, visual proof of blood relation captured permanently in silver and copper. Silas understood immediately that the daguerreotype in his hands was dangerous. If the Dandridge family saw it, there would be hell to pay, probably literally for the enslaved young man and his mother. If word got out, if this image circulated, it would destroy the Dandridge family's reputation. His first instinct was to destroy it immediately. Smash the plate, melt it down, pretend it had never existed. But Silas didn't destroy it. Instead, he wrapped it carefully in cloth and tucked it into the bottom of his equipment chest. He told himself he would get rid of it later, after he left Belle Reve. He told himself he was just being cautious, keeping it hidden until he was safely away from the plantation. The truth was more complicated. Some part of Silas, the part that had grown increasingly disgusted with what he witnessed on his travels, the part that hated being complicit in documenting the wealth built on human suffering, wanted to keep the evidence, wanted proof to exist that the system was built on hypocrisy and lies. He didn't know what he would do with the image, but he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy it. The next morning, Silas created the formal family portrait that Alistair Dandridge had commissioned. The whole family arranged themselves on the front portico, Alistair in the center looking stern and important, Evelyn beside him in a gown of dove-grey silk with her hands folded delicately in her lap, Thomas standing behind his father's right shoulder in his finest suit, and Catherine positioned at the end with an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. The exposure took nearly 12 minutes. Everyone had to remain absolutely still, which was torture in the July heat. Evelyn's left eyelid developed a twitch around minute 8. Catherine's expression evolved from annoyed to actively hostile. But when the image was finally developed that afternoon, it was perfect, a flawless record of Southern respectability and familial harmony. Alistair was so pleased with the results that he ordered 5 additional copies to be made and commissioned 3 more photographs, one of just himself for his study, one of Thomas for Evelyn's parlor, and a grand landscape shot of the entire plantation taken from the highest point on the property. Silas spent the next 4 days at Belle Reve, creating these additional images. He was treated well, given a room in the house rather than sleeping in his wagon, fed meals in the formal dining room, paid handsomely for his work. Alistair Dandridge was the kind of client any traveling professional would value. But the entire time, Silas was aware of the hidden daguerreotype at the bottom of his equipment chest. And he was aware of Samuel's presence, moving through the edges of daily life like a ghost, carefully avoiding any situation where he might be noticed by the white family he unknowingly resembled. On his final evening at Belle Reve, Silas saw something that would haunt him for years. He was packing his equipment in the fading twilight when he noticed Thomas standing alone on the second-floor balcony, staring out over the tobacco fields. And in the fields, barely visible in the dimming light, Samuel was working late, using the last of the daylight to finish some task. From Silas's angle, he could see both of them in profile against the sunset. The legitimate son above, the enslaved son below. Same face, different worlds. Thomas must have seen Samuel too, must have noticed the parallel because Silas saw him grip the balcony railing so hard his knuckles went white. Then Thomas turned abruptly and disappeared back into the house. Silas packed the last of his equipment and left Belle Reve the next morning with payment in hand and a dangerous secret in his wagon. He told himself he would destroy the compromising daguerreotype as soon as he reached the next town. He told himself this repeatedly as he traveled through Virginia, heading north toward Maryland. But he still didn't destroy it. Silas Croft reached Petersburg, Virginia, 3 days after leaving Belle Reve. He had picked up 2 more commissions along the way. A merchant family's portrait in a small town whose name he immediately forgot, and a daguerreotype of a deceased infant. One of those heartbreaking post-mortem photographs that were common in an era when childhood mortality was devastatingly high. Petersburg was a bustling town where Silas had established connections with several local businesses. One of his regular contacts was a printer named Douglas Webb, who specialized in creating copies of daguerreotypes. Webb had developed a reliable process for producing multiple paper prints from daguerreotype originals, which was valuable for customers who wanted to share images with distant relatives. Silas needed Webb to produce the additional copies that Alistair Dandridge had commissioned. He brought his plates to Webb's shop on a Tuesday afternoon, including the formal family portrait and the landscape shots. What happened next was either a genuine accident or the universe's way of ensuring that secrets don't stay buried. Years later, Silas would never be certain which. As Silas was unpacking his plates in Webb's workshop, showing him which images needed to be reproduced, one of the wrapped daguerreotypes slipped from his equipment case and fell to the floor. The cloth came partially unwrapped, revealing the edge of the hidden test shot, the one showing Thomas and Samuel in the same frame. Webb, helpful as always, picked it up before Silas could stop him. "Careful with that one," Silas said quickly, reaching for it. "It's just a test exposure, damaged, not for reproduction." But Webb had already glimpsed enough of the image to be curious. "Let me see, might be salvageable." He unwrapped it fully before Silas could intervene. Webb was a man who had looked at thousands of photographic images in his career. He had developed an eye for composition, for quality, for unusual or noteworthy content. And what he saw in this particular daguerreotype made him go very still. "Jesus Christ," he said softly. "It's nothing," Silas said, trying to take the plate back. "Like I said, just a damage test. I'll dispose of it." But Webb was still staring at it, his eyes moving between the 2 figures captured in silver. "Do you know who these people are?" Silas hesitated. "One of them is Thomas Dandridge. The other is someone who was passing through the frame during the test exposure." Webb looked up at him with an expression Silas couldn't quite read. "They could be twins." "I know. You know what this means, right? What this image suggests." "I know," Silas repeated, "which is why I'm going to destroy it as soon as I finish your commission." Webb carefully rewrapped the daguerreotype and handed it back. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Webb said quietly, "My younger brother is an abolitionist. He publishes a newsletter in Philadelphia. Images like this, they could be powerful ammunition for the cause." Silas felt his stomach drop. "No, absolutely not. I'm a professional photographer. I can't be involved in anything political. It would destroy my business. No one in the South would ever hire me again." "I'm not suggesting you be involved," Webb said. "I'm just saying, if a copy of that image somehow found its way to Philadelphia, if it got published with a description of what it depicts, it would force people to confront what actually happens on these plantations. The hypocrisy, the reality of enslaved children fathered by their own masters. And it would probably get the people in that image killed," Silas shot back. "The mother, the young man. Maybe others. You think Alistair Dandridge would let that kind of exposure go unpunished?" Webb nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have suggested it." They completed the transaction in uncomfortable silence. Webb produced the copies of the formal Dandridge portraits, charging his usual rate and accepting payment without further comment about the hidden daguerreotype. Silas left the shop believing the matter was closed. He was wrong. Douglas Webb was not a particularly political man by nature. He ran a printing business, attended church on Sundays, and generally avoided controversy. But his younger brother, Marcus Webb, was a different sort entirely. Marcus had left Petersburg 8 years earlier to attend seminary in Philadelphia. While there, he had fallen in with the passionate abolitionists who made Pennsylvania a center of anti-slavery activism. He had abandoned his plans for ministry and instead thrown himself into the movement, writing inflammatory articles, organizing speaking events, and publishing a monthly newsletter called the Liberty Standard that called for the immediate and complete abolition of slavery. Douglas didn't share his brother's fervor. He found Marcus exhausting and self-righteous, but he loved him and stayed in touch through regular letters. And 3 days after Silas Croft left his shop, Douglas sent Marcus one of those letters. He described the daguerreotype he had seen. He described the undeniable resemblance between the two young men. He described what he knew about the Dandridge family, their wealth, their prominence, their respectable reputation in Virginia society. And he mentioned, almost casually, that someone in the abolitionist movement might find such an image valuable as propaganda. Douglas told himself he was just sharing an interesting story with his brother. He wasn't actually suggesting Marcus do anything with the information. He was just mentioning it. Marcus Webb received the letter in late August. By early September, he had traveled to Petersburg under false pretenses, claiming to be visiting family, which was technically true, and convinced Douglas to make a single copy of the daguerreotype. Douglas resisted at first, citing all the same concerns Silas had raised. But Marcus was persuasive in that intense, moral certainty way that true believers often are. "This is evidence," Marcus argued. "This is proof of the system's fundamental evil. A man fathers a child, then enslaves that child, makes him work in his fields, denies his very humanity. And respectable society pretends not to see it because acknowledging it would be uncomfortable. This image forces people to see. It will put these people in danger," Douglas countered. "They're already in danger every day of their lives," Marcus said. "They're enslaved. What greater danger exists?" It was a terrible argument, callous and disconnected from reality, but it worked on some level. Douglas made the copy, just one. He told himself he was doing it for the cause, but really he was doing it because Marcus wouldn't stop pestering him until he did. Marcus took the copy back to Philadelphia. He showed it to other abolitionists, and in October of 1854, the Liberty Standard published a full-page article titled "The Sons of the South, a Daguerreotype Exposes Slavery's Hidden Shame." The article included a reproduced image, not a perfect copy of the original daguerreotype, but close enough to show the two young men and their undeniable resemblance. It included a detailed description of Belle Reeve, Alistair Dandridge, and the circumstances under which the photograph was taken. It included inflammatory rhetoric about the moral bankruptcy of a system that allowed fathers to enslave their own children. The Liberty Standard had a circulation of about 800 copies, mostly in Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. It was read primarily by people who already opposed slavery, people who nodded along and felt their existing beliefs confirmed. But 800 copies can travel far. They get passed around, discussed, excerpted in other publications. They find their way into unexpected hands. By November, a copy had reached Richmond. By December, someone in Norfolk had seen it and recognized the Dandridge name. And by January of 1855, whispered rumors were circulating through Tidewater, Virginia's social circles, asking uncomfortable questions about the family at Belle Reve. The first person to bring the rumors directly to the Dandridge family was Catherine, Alistair's unmarried sister. She had heard about it at a church social in early January from Beatrice Caldwell, a distant cousin who lived in Norfolk and who had a particular talent for delivering devastating information with a smile. "My dear Catherine," Beatrice had said, settling herself into a chair with obvious satisfaction at the gossip she was about to share. "I thought you should know that some rather distressing rumors have been circulating about your family. About Alistair, specifically." Catherine had felt her stomach tighten. "What sort of rumors?" "Well, it seems some abolitionist publication up north has gotten hold of a photograph. They're calling it proof of your brother's indiscretions. They're saying one of your slaves bears an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas." The room had seemed to tilt. Catherine had, of course, noticed Samuel's resemblance to Thomas years ago. She wasn't blind, but noticing was different from having it acknowledged, discussed, publicized. "That's absurd," she had said automatically, her voice sharp. "Abolitionist propaganda. They'll say anything to make our way of life look barbarous." Of course," Beatrice had agreed, in a tone that made clear she believed no such thing. "But you know how people talk. Even if it's all lies, the scandal of having such accusations published, well, it's bound to affect the family's standing." Catherine had left the social immediately, claiming a headache, and returned to Belle Reve in a state of cold fury. She found Alistair in his study that evening and closed the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said, "about your bastard." The confrontation that followed was one of the ugliest in Dandridge family history. Alistair tried to deny everything at first, claiming the rumors were fabricated, that abolitionists were trying to destroy respectable Southern families with lies and doctored photographs. But Catherine wasn't having it. "I have eyes, Alistair. I've seen Samuel. Everyone has seen him. He looks exactly like Thomas, exactly. Like our father. Like our grandfather. He has the Dandridge eyes, for God's sake. You're imagining things." "Don't you dare," Catherine cut him off, her voice shaking with rage. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence. You forced yourself on that woman. You fathered a child with her, and then you kept them both here, enslaved, where we all have to see the evidence of your depravity every single day." Alistair's face had gone purple. "Watch your tongue. This is my house." "This was our father's house," Catherine shot back, "and our grandfather's, and you've disgraced it. You've made a mockery of our family name, and now it's all coming out, published in newspapers, passed around like scandal sheets. Do you have any idea what this will do to Thomas's prospects? What respectable family will want their daughter to marry into a household embroiled in this kind of ugliness?" That hit home. Alistair had been planning to announce Thomas's engagement to a young woman from a prominent Richmond family that spring. The union would cement important political connections and expand the Dandridge influence considerably. But if scandal surrounded the family name... "What do you suggest?" he asked finally, his voice tight. "Get rid of him," Catherine said immediately. "Sell Samuel. Sell him south to Georgia or Alabama, where no one knows about this ridiculous photograph. Get him out of Virginia. Let people forget what he looks like. And his mother. Sell her too. Sell them both together if you must, but get them away from here. It's the only way to make this go away." Alistair considered this. It was a practical solution. Enslaved people were sold away from their birthplaces every day. No one would think twice about it. But there was a complication Catherine didn't know about. A complication Alistair had never told anyone. He had promised Ilara years ago in a moment of guilt-stricken weakness that he would never sell Samuel. It had been a stupid promise, made after he had visited the slave quarters in the night and found her holding their infant son. She had looked at him with such profound despair that something in him had cracked. "I won't sell him," he had whispered. "Or you. I promise." It was the only kindness he had ever shown her, and it was barely even kindness, more like a slightly less terrible cruelty. But he had meant it at the time. Now, 23 years later, that promise had become an enormous liability. "I'll think about it," he told Catherine. She looked at him with disgust. "You're still protecting her, aren't you? After everything, after the shame this has brought on us, you're still protecting your Negro whore." "Get out," Alistair said quietly. Catherine left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the paintings on the walls. Evelyn Dandridge had not been present for this conversation, but she heard about it anyway. The enslaved house servants heard everything that happened in the main house. They were invisible to white people in the way furniture was invisible, present, but not considered capable of judgment or memory. And the house servants talked among themselves. By the next morning, Evelyn knew that Catherine had confronted Alistair. She knew what the rumors were claiming. She knew that a photograph existed somewhere that provided visual evidence of what she had suspected, but never acknowledged for over 20 years. Evelyn was 52 years old that winter. She had been married to Alistair for 23 years. She had spent those years managing his household, raising his son, entertaining his guests, and maintaining the flawless facade of respectability that her social position demanded. And she had spent all those years pretending not to know that her husband had raped an enslaved woman and fathered a child who worked in their fields. She had seen Samuel, of course, had noticed the resemblance. But she had perfected the art of not seeing, of looking past uncomfortable truths, of maintaining plausible deniability. It was a skill that many Southern white women of her class had mastered. The ability to know and not know simultaneously, to live with betrayal by simply refusing to acknowledge it existed. But a photograph changed everything. Visual evidence couldn't be ignored the same way whispered suspicions could. And knowing that strangers in Philadelphia and Norfolk and Richmond were looking at that image, seeing what it revealed, discussing her humiliation, that was intolerable. Evelyn had not confronted Alistair about his affairs in more than 15 years. She had learned early in their marriage that such confrontations accomplished nothing except making her seem hysterical and shrewish. Southern manhood gave Alistair the right to do whatever he wanted with enslaved women, and Southern womanhood gave Evelyn the responsibility to pretend it wasn't happening. But the rules changed when the affair became public, when it threatened their family's social position, when it affected Thomas. She found Alistair in his study 2 days after Catherine's confrontation. "We need to discuss our son's future," she said, her voice calm and controlled in that way that signaled barely suppressed fury. Alistair looked up from his papers warily. "What about it?" "The Birmingham family has withdrawn their daughter from consideration as a bride for Thomas." The color drained from Alistair's face. The Birminghams were the Richmond family he had been negotiating with for months. The planned marriage was supposed to be announced at a major social event in March. "Why?" he asked, though he already knew. "They cited concerns about family reputation," Evelyn said. "They didn't specify further, but I'm certain you can guess the nature of their concerns." Alistair said nothing. "This is going to destroy him," Evelyn continued. "Our son, the legitimate son you actually claim. His prospects, his future, his standing in society, all of it will be tainted by this scandal. Because you couldn't control your base appetites, because you had to force yourself on a woman who couldn't refuse you." "Evelyn, I'm not finished," she cut him off. "For 23 years I have maintained this household. I have managed your home, raised your son, entertained your associates, and presented a perfect face to society. I have done everything expected of me. And you have repaid me with humiliation. It was decades ago. And yet the evidence still walks around our property every day, Evelyn said coldly. The evidence is 22 years old and has your face. How exactly am I supposed to pretend that doesn't exist when there's a photograph of it being passed around abolitionist circles? Alistair stood up, frustrated. What do you want me to do? I can't unmake the past. You can deal with the present, Evelyn said. Catherine is right. They need to be sold, both of them, immediately. Sold south where no one will connect them to this family. It's the only way to minimize the damage. I can't, Alistair said quietly. Evelyn stared at him. What do you mean you can't? I promised her I wouldn't sell them. The silence that followed was terrible. Evelyn's face went through several expressions. Disbelief, rage, something that might have been profound hurt, before settling into a mask of frozen contempt. You promised her, she repeated. You made a promise to your slave woman. Evelyn, you've broken every promise you made to me, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But the promise you made to the woman you raped, that one you intend to keep, that's where your honor lies. It's not that simple. Get out of my sight, Evelyn said. I don't want to look at you. Alistair left his own study because it was easier than continuing the conversation. Thomas learned about the photograph and the scandal from a friend in Richmond who sent him a discreet letter in mid-January. The letter included a clipped excerpt from the Liberty Standard article, though not the actual image itself. Thomas read it alone in his room, his hands trembling. Seeing the truth laid out in print, the legitimate heir and the enslaved son, captured together by accident, revealed the hidden reality of plantation life, made it impossible to maintain his carefully constructed denial. He had known, on some level, for years. But knowing privately and having it published for strangers to read were entirely different experiences. The letter from his friend ended with sympathetic but pointed advice. You may want to distance yourself from Belle Rave for a while until this all settles down. Perhaps extended travel would be beneficial. Thomas understood what that meant. His friend was suggesting he flee, essentially. Run away to Europe or up north and wait for the scandal to fade. Abandon his family to deal with the consequences alone. He couldn't do that. Whatever his father's sins, and they were enormous, Thomas couldn't just disappear. But he also couldn't stay at Belle Reve and pretend everything was normal. Not anymore. Not with the truth hovering over everything like a dark cloud. That evening, Thomas did something he had never done before. He went down to the slave quarters after dark. The slave quarters at Belle Reve were a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, past the dependencies and work buildings. Thomas had rarely ventured there in his entire life. White members of the plantation-owning family didn't go to the quarters unless there was a specific problem requiring attention. But Thomas walked there deliberately that night, his heart pounding, not entirely sure what he was doing or why. He found Ilara's cabin. He knew which one it was because he had asked one of the house servants years ago in a moment of curiosity he had never acted on. It was one of the slightly better cabins, with actual glass in the window and a door that closed properly. Small privileges granted to house servants. He knocked quietly. After a long moment, the door opened. Ilara stood there, 43 years old, still beautiful despite years of labor and fear. When she saw Thomas, her expression went carefully blank. "Master Thomas," she said quietly, "is something wrong?" Everything about her posture was guarded, protective. Thomas realized with a sick feeling that she was afraid of him. Of course she was. A white man coming to a slave cabin at night never meant anything good. "I need to talk to Samuel," Thomas said. "Is he here?" "He's done nothing wrong," Ilara said immediately, defensively. "I know. I'm not here to... I just need to talk to him." Ilara hesitated, then stepped aside. The cabin's interior was small and spare. A few pieces of simple furniture, a hearth, 2 narrow beds. Samuel was sitting at a rough table, mending a shirt by candlelight. When he saw Thomas, he stood immediately, his expression wary. The resemblance was even more striking in the small cabin's candlelight. Thomas felt dizzy looking at him. "Leave us," Thomas said to Ilara. "No," Ilara said firmly. "If you want to speak to my son, you'll do it with me present." Thomas was so surprised by her defiance, slaves didn't refuse direct orders from white family members, that he simply nodded. "All right." An uncomfortable silence followed. Thomas didn't know how to begin. Finally, Samuel spoke. "We heard about the photograph." His voice was quiet but steady. "You did?" "News travels. Even to people like us." Thomas flinched at the phrasing. "People like us." The acknowledged difference. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. The words felt inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry you're in danger because of something that's not your fault." Samuel's expression didn't change. "We've always been in danger. That's what it means to be property." "You're my brother," Thomas said, suddenly surprising himself. "You're my half-brother. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it." "Does your father know it?" Samuel asked. Thomas didn't know how to answer that. Ilara spoke up, her voice hard. "Your father knows exactly what he did, and he's known for 22 years what the consequences were. He chose to keep us here anyway. Chose to watch Samuel grow up enslaved. Chose to let you grow up in privilege while your brother worked in the fields. That wasn't ignorance. That was choice." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I know. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make any of this right." "You can't," Samuel said simply. "What's done is done. My father's considering selling you," Thomas said. "Both of you. Sending you south to make the scandal go away." He saw terror flash across both their faces before they controlled it. Being sold south was one of the most feared fates for enslaved people in Virginia. It meant separation from everyone you knew, harsher working conditions, higher mortality rates. It meant disappearing. "Can you stop him?" Ilara asked. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I don't have any real authority here. I'm just his son." "You're his legitimate son," Samuel corrected. "That counts for something." They talked for nearly an hour in that cabin, a bizarre and unprecedented conversation among three people whose lives had been shaped by the same man in completely different ways. Thomas learned things about Samuel's life that shamed him, the casual cruelties, the constant fear, the way every day required a careful performance of subservience just to survive. When Thomas finally left, he had no solutions, but he had something he hadn't had before. A direct connection to the human being at the center of this scandal. A brother he had spent 22 years pretending not to see. And he had a growing conviction that what was happening at Belle Reve was profoundly, irredeemably wrong. February 1855 brought an unexpected visitor to Belle Reve. Beatrice Caldwell, the distant cousin from Norfolk who had first brought the rumors to Catherine's attention. Beatrice arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, her carriage rolling up the oak-lined drive with an air of purpose that immediately set everyone on edge. She was a woman in her early 50s, wealthy in her own right from her late husband's shipping business and possessed of that particular brand of social power that comes from knowing everyone's secrets and having no compunction about weaponizing them. Evelyn received her in the formal parlor with all the grace her position demanded, though she would have preferred to turn Beatrice away at the door. "Beatrice, what an unexpected pleasure," Evelyn said, her tone making clear it was no pleasure at all. "Darling Evelyn," Beatrice replied, settling herself into the best chair without waiting for an invitation. "I've been hearing such concerning things, and I simply had to come see how you all were managing." "We're managing perfectly well." "Are you?" "Because the talk in Norfolk hasn't died down at all. If anything, it's getting worse. People have started sending for copies of that abolitionist newspaper just to see the photograph. It's become quite the sensation." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten. "People will always gossip. It means nothing." "Oh, but it does mean something, dear. It means invitations are being reconsidered. It means business relationships are being quietly ended. It means your family's name is becoming associated with scandal." Beatrice leaned forward conspiratorially. I heard the Birminghams withdrew their daughter from consideration as Thomas's bride. Is that true? That's private family business. So it is true. Beatrice looked genuinely delighted. How devastating for you. And for Thomas. The poor boy must be beside himself. Thomas is fine. Is he? Because I've heard he's been seen doing the most peculiar thing, visiting the slave quarters at night. Surely that can't be true. It would be so improper. Evelyn felt cold panic flood through her. If word was spreading about Thomas visiting Samuel, it would only fuel more speculation and scandal. The optics were terrible. I think you should leave, Beatrice. Oh, I haven't even told you why I came yet, Beatrice said, her smile sharp. I'm hosting a tea next month, a gathering of the most prominent families in Norfolk and the surrounding area. I would very much like the Dandridge family to attend. This was a trap, obviously, but refusing would be even worse than accepting. It would look like they were hiding, admitting guilt. We would be delighted, Evelyn lied. Wonderful. I'll send the formal invitation. Do bring Thomas. I'm sure everyone is eager to see how the young man is holding up under such trying circumstances. After Beatrice left, Evelyn sat alone in the parlor for a long time, feeling the walls of her carefully maintained world closing in. The next few weeks saw a series of increasingly desperate family meetings. Alistair, Evelyn, Catherine, and Thomas gathered behind closed doors to discuss their options, their voices rising in frustration and fear. Catherine continued to push for selling Samuel and Elara. It's the only solution. Every day they remain here, they're living evidence of the scandal. Thomas, to everyone's surprise, pushed back. They're people, not evidence. You can't just dispose of them because they're inconvenient. They're slaves, Catherine snapped. That's exactly what you can do with them. They're my brother and his mother, Thomas said, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. Whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not, the room went silent. It was the first time anyone in the family had said it out loud so directly. Alistair looked at his son with an expression somewhere between rage and despair. You will not speak of this. Why not? Everyone else is speaking of it. There's a photograph circulating through the northern states showing us standing together. What exactly am I not supposed to say? Thomas, enough, Evelyn said sharply, but Thomas was past being silenced. No, not enough. We've all been pretending for years, pretending we don't see it, pretending it didn't happen. But it did happen, and Samuel has paid for father's sins every day of his life while we've lived in comfort. That's the truth, whether it's convenient or not. Your youthful righteousness is touching but useless, Catherine said coldly. The question isn't what's morally correct. The question is how to protect this family's reputation. By selling my brother like livestock. By doing what's necessary. Alistair finally spoke, his voice heavy. The decision is mine to make, and I've decided. They stay. Everyone stared at him. You can't be serious, Catherine said. I made a promise, years ago, and despite everything, I intend to keep it. You're going to destroy this family for a promise made to a slave woman. Catherine's voice was shrill with disbelief. This family is already destroyed, Alistair said quietly. Selling them won't fix that. It'll just add more sin to the pile. It was perhaps the closest Alistair Dandridge had ever come to acknowledging remorse, but it was too little, far too late. The tea at Beatrice Caldwell's Norfolk estate took place on the first Saturday in March. The Dandridge family arrived together in their finest carriage, dressed immaculately, presenting a united front of respectability. It was an ambush. The gathering included about 30 women from prominent Virginia families, all of whom had ostensibly come for refined conversation and delicate refreshments. But the moment the Dandridges arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes assessed and judged. Beatrice greeted them with effusive warmth that was entirely performative. The Dandridges, how wonderful that you could join us. Please come in. Everyone is so eager to see you. The tea proceeded with all the formal rituals, pouring, stirring, delicate bites of cake. But the conversation was pointed, designed to draw blood. One woman asked Evelyn with false concern, "How are you managing, dear? All this dreadful gossip must be so trying. Another turned to Thomas and said, I understand you've been taking a special interest in the welfare of your family's slaves. How progressive of you. The questions kept coming, each one carefully phrased to sound innocent while actually being viciously pointed. It was a masterclass in Southern passive aggression, the particular skill of destroying someone while maintaining plausible deniability about one's intentions. Then Beatrice dealt the final blow. I have something I thought might interest everyone, she announced during a lull in conversation. She produced a folded newspaper from beside her chair, a copy of the Liberty Standard with its inflammatory article and the reproduced photograph. This has been circulating in certain circles, she said. I managed to acquire a copy. It makes such fascinating claims about our dear friends the Dandridges. She proceeded to read excerpts aloud, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The article's descriptions of Alistair's assault on Ilara, the detailed comparison of Thomas and Samuel's features, the accusations of moral bankruptcy and hypocrisy. Evelyn sat frozen, her teacup suspended halfway to her lips, unable to move or speak. Thomas had gone pale, his hands clenched in his lap. Catherine looked murderous. When Beatrice finished reading, she looked up with wide, innocent eyes. Of course, I'm sure it's all abolitionist lies, but the photograph itself is quite striking. The resemblance is remarkable, wouldn't you say? She passed the newspaper around the room. Woman after woman looked at the photograph, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacular fall from grace. Thomas stood abruptly. We're leaving. But you've barely touched your tea, Beatrice protested with false concern. We're leaving now, Thomas repeated, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. The Dandridge family left Beatrice's estate in silence, their humiliation complete and public. The ride back to Belle Reve was silent for the first hour. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice eerily calm. This can't continue. What do you propose? Alistair asked wearily. I'm taking Catherine and moving to my sister's house in Charleston. I will not remain in this house with you. I will not continue to be humiliated by your past actions. Evelyn, I'm not negotiating, Alistair. I'm informing you of my decision. You can keep your plantation, your slaves, your bastard son, and your promises. I'm leaving. Mother, wait, Thomas started. You'll need to decide where your loyalties lie, Evelyn said, looking at her son. You can come with us and distance yourself from this scandal, or you can stay here with your father and be dragged down with him. Thomas looked between his parents, torn. I can't just abandon. Abandon who? Evelyn cut him off. Your father, after what he's done? Or are you more concerned about abandoning your newfound brother in the slave quarters? The contempt in her voice was withering. I don't know, Thomas admitted quietly. Then figure it out, Evelyn said. You have until tomorrow morning. That night, Thomas made his decision. He went to his father's study where Alistair sat alone, drinking whiskey in the dark. I'm staying, Thomas said from the doorway. Alistair looked up, surprised. Your mother is leaving because she can't face the truth. I understand that. But running away won't change what happened. It won't make Samuel any less my brother. You're throwing away your future, Alistair said. Your social prospects, your political ambitions, all of it. Maybe. But I can't build a future on pretending certain people don't exist. That's what you did. And look where it got you. Alistair flinched. What do you want from me? An apology? Would that fix anything? No, Thomas said, but manumission papers would. Alistair stared at him. You want me to free them? I want you to do the right thing for once. Free Samuel and Ilara. Give them papers. Give them enough money to start a life somewhere else, somewhere safe. Let them go. If I free them now, in the middle of this scandal, it will be seen as admission of guilt. You are guilty, Thomas said bluntly. Everyone knows it. The only question is whether you'll do anything to make it right. And if I refuse? Thomas met his father's eyes. Then I'll wait until you die and do it myself. I'm your heir. Eventually Belle Reve will be mine, and the first thing I'll do is free every single person you've enslaved here." It was a threat and a promise. Alistair recognized the determination in his son's voice, the same stubborn certainty that the Dandridge men had possessed for generations, now turned against the family's traditions. "You've become self-righteous," Alistair said. "I've become honest," Thomas corrected. "That feels radical, because we've been living in lies for so long." 3 days later, on a cold March morning, Alistair Dandridge signed manumission papers for Ilara and Samuel. The papers declared them free, no longer enslaved, with all the legal rights afforded to free people of color in Virginia. It wasn't much. Virginia law in 1855 was deeply restrictive toward free black people, requiring them to leave the state within a year of gaining freedom or risk being re-enslaved. But it was something. It was a door opening. Alistair also provided them with $200 in cash, enough to travel north and establish themselves somewhere beyond Virginia's reach. When Thomas brought Ilara the papers, she wept. She had spent 25 years enslaved, had borne a son in bondage, had endured assault and degradation, and the daily terror of knowing she and her child could be sold at any moment. And now, suddenly, she was free. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. "Philadelphia," Ilara said immediately. "I have cousins there who moved north years ago. They'll help us establish ourselves." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, "for everything, for all the years you suffered because of my father." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. "You're not your father. Remember that." Samuel joined them, holding his own set of freedom papers, his hands trembling slightly. Thomas looked at his half-brother, no qualifiers needed, and extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel shook it. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly. "Don't thank me. This is the bare minimum of what you're owed." They left Belle Reve 2 days later at dawn, with a bag of belongings and those precious papers that declared them free. Thomas watched them go from the upper balcony, feeling a complicated mix of relief and grief. They were safe now, but their freedom had come at an immense cost, and decades too late. Evelyn Dandridge never returned to Belle Reve. She lived with her sister in Charleston until her death in 1867, maintaining to the end that she had been the victim of her husband's moral failures. She never spoke to Alistair again. Catherine moved with her, equally bitter, equally determined to distance herself from the scandal that had tainted the family name. Alistair remained at Belle Reve, watching his social standing crumble over the next few years. Former friends stopped visiting. Business relationships dried up. The Richmond political circles that had once courted his influence now avoided him. He died in 1859, a wealthy man in financial terms, but socially isolated, his reputation forever marked by the photograph that had exposed his sins. Thomas inherited Belle Reve and, true to his word, began the process of freeing the enslaved people there. He did it gradually to avoid financial ruin, offering wages to those who stayed as free workers and providing resources to those who chose to leave. By 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Belle Reve was already operating as a paid labor farm. He never married. He spent his remaining years trying to make amends for his family's actions, though he never quite succeeded in forgiving himself for the years he spent pretending not to see. Ilara and Samuel reached Philadelphia in April of 1855. They settled in the city's growing free black community, finding work and gradually building new lives. Samuel learned carpentry and eventually opened his own small shop. He married, had children, lived to see the Civil War end slavery throughout the nation. Ilara lived to be 73 years old. In her final years, she would occasionally speak about Belle Reve, but only in fragments, brief memories that surfaced and then retreated, too painful to dwell on for long. The daguerreotype that started it all, the original plate that Silas Croft had captured by accident, was destroyed. Silas eventually learned what his photograph had unleashed and smashed the plate in a fit of guilt and horror at the chaos he'd inadvertently caused. But copies remained, The image published in the Liberty Standard continued to circulate through abolitionist circles for years, used as propaganda to demonstrate the hypocrisy of the slave-owning class. Even after the Civil War, it occasionally appeared in historical collections, labeled simply, Two Sons of the South. Looking at that photograph now, knowing its history, one can't help but see it as evidence of something larger than one family's scandal. It captured the fundamental lie at the heart of American slavery, the fiction that human beings could be divided into categories of free and enslaved based on race, even when their blood was the same, even when their faces reflected the same ancestry. The resemblance between Thomas and Samuel wasn't unusual. It was repeated on plantations across the South, wherever enslaved women were vulnerable to their owners' violence. What was unusual was that it got documented, captured in permanent form, impossible to deny or explain away. One photograph exposed everything, not just the Dandridge family's specific sins, but the broader truth about how the plantation system functioned, who it harmed, and what it asked everyone involved to pretend they didn't see. The image forced people to look at what they had been trained to ignore, and once seen, truly seen, it couldn't be unseen. That was the photograph's power. That was why it destroyed the family at Belle Reve. That was why, more than 170 years later, its story still resonates, because it's a reminder that some truths, once captured and exposed, cannot be buried again, no matter how desperately people try.